I want to tell you about my guest. It's a very special person. My guest is author Roz Savage. We will be talking to her about her new book from Simon & Schuster, Rowing the Atlantic, Lessons Learned on the Open Ocean. Roz was a management consultant and investment banker. When in her mid-30s, her marriage began to unravel and she felt stuck in the corporate rut. She felt there was more to life, so she turned her back on her job and husband and went on in 2005 at the age of 37 to become the only solo female competitor in the Atlantic rowing race, the first woman to row solo in that race, and the sixth woman to row an ocean solo. Well, my goodness, Roz, welcome to the show, From the Desert to the Ocean. How are you?
I'm very well indeed, thank you. Great to be here.
Well, it's great to have you here because this is quite a story. Your new book, as we said, is Rowing the Atlantic, Lessons Learned on the Open Ocean, is an inspiring story, but I guess I have to ask the question, and I'm not making light of your challenge, but why not just get a new job and maybe a different man? Why did you need to test yourself by rowing the Atlantic of all things?
Well, maybe I go from one extreme to the other. I suppose I was looking for a project that would define this new direction I was heading in. After the end of my marriage and the end of the job, I went through, I suppose, really quite a process of examining my values. I'd been living a very materialistic life up until that point and had, I suppose, been in the fortunate position to find that having a big house and lots of possessions doesn't actually make you happy. And so that was quite a revelation for me, quite a shocking revelation. I'd grown up in a family with not very much stuff, and I suppose, or not very much money, and I suppose the grass had always been greener. I'd always thought that all these things were going to make me happy. And when that turned out not to be true, it caused a bit of an emotional crisis.
Yes.
So I'd done a lot of thinking, and I was really just looking for a project that I suppose would declare to the world this new value system that I was developing for myself.
Well, let me ask you a question here. You have a very interesting accent, and for our listeners, what is your home country?
I'm British originally,
yes. And you grew up in Great Britain or one of the other parts of Scotland, Ireland, England? Which one?
I grew up in England.
In
various towns, yes. As a Methodist preacher, my dad chose to move around a lot.
Yes.
So I suppose maybe I was always a little bit more independent, a little bit more the loner than average. Although having said that, I love being around people as well. And I'm never so happy as when I finish an ocean row and get back to dry land.
Right. Well, it was 3,000 miles from the Canary Islands to Antigua, the course of the race. Why did you choose that particular race?
Well, originally I was planning just to do a solo expedition. I didn't really want to be in a race. But for various reasons, including the fact that I was buying my boat from the race organisers, I was sort of coerced into taking part in the race. And it was probably very good for me, for my first ocean, to have that race structure. They've got very strict requirements for safety equipment and training courses that you have to do beforehand. Although it did also create that extra pressure, I didn't really enjoy the fact of being in a race. And since the Atlantic, I've now actually completed two stages out of a three-stage row across the Pacific, just as a solo independent expedition. And I found that psychologically much more enjoyable.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll certainly get into some more details about that a little later. But I guess my question is, you had knowledge, you had a background in rowing, and were you familiar with what was out there? I mean, it's not like this just came to you out of the heavens that you're going to take this race from Canary Islands. So there was a path that you took. And maybe we should go back at this point, back to your time before the race. And here you are unhappy with your life, with what sounds like the perfect man. and all of this, of course, is in the book. You had an affair which your husband learned about, and you worked at trying to save the marriage, but after 11 years, you divorced. So perhaps this is the time to ask you, what did you do first after that? And I think that will then make it clearer for our listeners what led you to this race.
Well, I suppose it was there was a whole sequence of events and moments. I suppose the first big step that I took after the end of the marriage, although in fact the end of the marriage itself was the biggest step I've ever taken in my life.
I'm sure.
The first thing after that was I decided that I did want to do something more adventurous, or certainly more adventurous than working in an office cubicle. So I managed to convince the leader of an expedition to Peru that I would be a valuable member of his team. So I suppose I was already starting off down this path towards adventure and physical exercise, because the expedition, although it's an archaeological one, was very physical. We were trekking through the cloud forest near Machu Picchu, and so it was really quite strenuous. And I had the most amazing time in Peru. It was a very educational experience for me, and I suppose gave me a bit of confidence that I could go off and do something adventurous. And in fact, after the expedition, I stayed on in Peru for another couple of months, just traveling around on my own, which was a very formative experience. So that was one step. It was actually through the trip to Peru that I first came across the whole crazy idea of ocean rowing, because I became a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society. And through that, I met a guy who had rowed across the Atlantic several years previously with his mother, of all people. And so I suppose that gave me the idea that rowing across oceans, especially with my college rowing experience, was something that would be the perfect balance between challenging yet doable. Although little did I suspect at that stage just the enormous difference between rowing on the River Thames and rowing across the Atlantic Ocean.
Well, to me, what's interesting, too, is just, as you said, the divorce was certainly a challenge in itself, and then you go to Peru, but you also spent time before. I think it's important for the listeners to know that you did spend time just kind of going from one place to another, and you sold all of your possessions, and you were selling at one time organic cakes in a farmer's market to cover your daily expenses. Was that in Peru, or was that before you went?
No, that was in London. That was actually after I came back, when I was sort of searching around for the next perfect project.
So you came back, and where did you run the marathons? Because you got into a couple of marathons that didn't quite satisfy you. Where did that take place?
I did those while I was still married. I did those before the big life change.
Okay.
But, my first marathon was in New York in 1998, and then the second one was in London in 2001. And part of the reason that I wanted to do the marathons was because friends who'd done them said you find out things about yourself in the last 6 miles of a marathon. And so I suppose that's what I was looking for. I was trying to find out more about myself and what I was capable of. And I found through doing the marathons, really just that I don't enjoy running marathons. they really hurt, and they make your toenails drop off. So I suppose maybe I was just looking for a longer, tougher challenge that would allow me a bit more opportunity to spend time on my own. And I suppose another very formative step in that evolution was when I went off to a cottage in Ireland, on the west coast of Ireland, with just a rucksack full of books. And it was a very special time for me, really just a contemplation and reading and thinking and scribbling away in my journal.
How old were you at this point?
I went to Ireland the year that I decided I was going to row the Atlantic. So I was 36.
Mm-hmm.
And I think maybe that's something that a number of people in their mid-30s go through, of saying, this life that I've been living so far, not sure it's quite working. And I think quite a few people go for a bit of a change of direction, maybe not as dramatic as mine, but it's a good time when you get to, I suppose, coming up to that halfway point through your life, where you just question where you're going and wonder if it is the right way, or if there's a different path that you'd like to take before it gets too late.
Well, that's true, and a turning point came for you. You read a book by someone, Deborah Veal. What did that do for you in reading that? And tell my listeners a little bit about that story and how that became a bit of an epiphany for you.
Well, Deborah and her husband set out to row the Atlantic in 2001. And her husband, who I actually know quite well, he's a good friend, Andrew Veal, tall, strapping lad, about 6'5", and, I don't know, well over 200 pounds, big, strong rower, actually discovered once they got out on the open ocean that he just couldn't handle it. He had this combination of claustrophobia and agoraphobia and really just abject fear. And he ended up curled up in the fetal position in their cabin while Deborah was actually having a great time. So eventually Andrew had to be lifted off the boat by the support vessel, and Deborah carried on her own. And I suppose up until when I read that book, I'd always imagined that to be an adventurer, you had to be, some great big strong guy, preferably ex-military, with a beard and, just that kind of adventure-type person. And I never thought that a person like me could actually go and have a similar adventure.
Could you describe the boats that are used for this kind of a journey, this kind of a competition? They're not great big boats, are they?
Well, they're fairly big for one person to row. It's funny, sailors tend to say, that boat's tiny, whereas rowers go, that boat's huge. So I suppose it just depends on your perspective. The boat's 23 feet long and about 6 feet wide, and it's got a cabin at each end, one for sleeping and one for storage. And then there's an area in the middle which is open to the elements, and that's where all the rowing goes on.
Mm-hmm. I'm looking at some of the pictures in the book. But they still look tiny to me to think about being on an open ocean in this, and yet you soon learn in reading the book how difficult it became to do this. So, well, that tells us a little bit about how you came to the point of wanting to do the rowing, and soon you've made that decision that you are going to do it. Very briefly, could you tell us a little more about the boat? Did you have to have it made for you, or is it something that you can just go out and buy on the market?
You can't really. There aren't that many outlets for ocean rowing boats, not surprisingly, but they are fairly available. Most of them are bought from the people who organise the Atlantic rowing race, and there are a couple of standard designs. There used to be a flat pack wooden design that you received as a whole load of panels and you put it together yourself. But mine was the first of the moulded carbon fibre boats, and I bought it from the guy whose company organises the Atlantic rowing race. He'd had it built for him. So I bought it just as an empty shell. It had absolutely no fixtures and fittings on board. So I had to design how I was going to turn this empty shell into a working rowboat that would also be my home, my whole life support system.
What do they weigh about?
When it was fully kitted out and loaded, it was about 1,200 pounds.
So this is something, 1,200 pounds, with all equipment that you are going to be putting into the water and rowing across this great ocean. Well, we're certainly going to get in some more details about that, but I'd like to hold off for that with that for just a minute. How did you equip it?
In terms of what technology did
the sort
I
of
have
thing,
on board?
yes, the sort of things that you put into it. We have about a minute to, if you could just give us a quick description about some of those things, and we'll go into more detail.
Sure. Well, probably the most important piece of equipment is the water maker, which desalinates seawater. It pulls that in through a hole in the hull and through reverse osmosis turns it into drinking water. So that is what my life depends on. Also satellite phone, GPS for navigation, and quite a few cameras and things. I wanted to film my experience out there.
Let's now start with when you got started with this. You're all ready to go. here you are, you're ready to begin your big adventure, and the horn sounded before you were even able to row to the starting line. And you had other challenges as well. Would you give us a brief picture of that first day?
It was a little bit stressful. Yes, I was the last boat to leave the dock because they were setting the boats out in a particular order, and I suppose they expected that as the only solo woman I would be the slowest, so I was the last one off from the dock. So that wasn't a nice feeling to be playing catch-up right from the start. And I suppose the lowest point of that first day was round about sunset when I was seasick.
Oh, dear.
There were big swells out there, and I had been out sailing in the run-up to the row so that I would get some ocean experience. And I'd felt queasy before, but never actually been sick. But these rowboats, they really do tip around a lot. And as the day went on, I was just feeling worse and worse until by sunset I was there hanging over the side, feeling extremely sorry for myself.
How did you prepare for the race? What kind of training did you get yourself into, or were you told that you needed to do? I just can't imagine. I've seen your picture. You're how tall are you, first of all? You look like a tiny woman.
I'm about 5'4".
Yes, well, you're just about my height. And did you have to lift weights, or what did you have to do?
I did loads of training. I think I actually did far more than was recommended by the race organisers. I was training for up to 16 hours in a day. I did a succession of 5 Sundays when I would do 16 hours on the rowing machine in 4 shifts of 4 hours. So I would start at about lunchtime on the Sunday and row through until breakfast time on the Monday, doing 4 hours on, 1 hour off. I was also lifting weights, running, cross-training, just really going for it. And the whole idea of doing all that training was so that it wouldn't be a shock to my body when I actually started rowing on the ocean. But unfortunately, that theory didn't work. And within the first week, I developed tendinitis in my shoulders. And that continued to plague me the whole way across. And I was taking painkillers more often than not.
Were you given that advice that was the type of training that you needed rather than getting out on the open ocean and trying to build yourself up that way?
Well,
did someone tell you that?
My boat was in the boatyard for most of the time in the run-up to the race.
I see.
It was only ready in the nick of time to go into the shipping container to go from Britain to the Canaries. So I had very limited opportunity to actually get out on the water.
Oh, dear.
Well, I think ultimately, I don't think it really made that much difference. I think that I had to do I had to log a certain number of hours in the rowboat to qualify for the race, and I did that recommended minimum. And I'm not sure it would have made that much difference, because even if I'd have been going out regularly, the open ocean is a very different proposition from rowing close to shore. The waves get much bigger out there. So I think, in fact, the time that I spent going out and getting sailing experience out on the open ocean, I went on 3 voyages of 2 weeks each, way out into the Atlantic. And I think that was actually that was probably a more valuable experience than any amount of coastal rowing would have been.
There were something like 26 entrants in this race.
26 crews, yeah.
20. Now, what's the typical crew? Is it typically just 2 people, or can there be more than 2?
The race that I was in, there were 4 crews of 4 people, and 2 solos, me and a solo guy, and then the remainder of the crews were pairs.
You were the only solo?
I was the only solo woman. Yes, there was a solo guy as well.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't understand that. There was another man. There was a man, solo man. So there were 2 of you that were doing it solo. I'm just sitting here trying to imagine what that's like, and even having looked at the pictures and read the book, I still can't imagine what that must be like. Go into a little more detail about the fact that here you are, you're having problems, you've already got tendinitis, you have so many other things happening. You went into hock, friends and family helped out, and you bought the boat, and here you are on your way. Tell us a little more about these early problems.
Well, I think that first month of the race was pretty harrowing. I realised within the first 2 or 3 days just how tough this was going to be, physically and psychologically. And I think in many ways I actually felt pretty stupid. I thought, what on earth was I thinking when I decided to do this? Nobody forced me to do it. I'm here strictly because I wanted to be. And I just thought, oh my word, but I can't turn back now. I mean, apart from anything else, it's physically impossible to turn around and row into the trade winds because they're blowing too strongly. So I really had to pretty much just figure out how I was going to hang on in there and get across to the other side without going absolutely crazy. And it was a very steep learning curve. And this is really what the book is about, I think, because I was just forced to find a way of living out there that I could handle. And one of the biggest things that I learned was just to take it one day at a time, because the really big mistakes that I made in those early days was to look at the whole 3,000 miles that lay ahead of me and always be thinking, oh, well, at this rate it's going to take me 2 months, and then maybe the next would be like, oh, no, it's going to take me 3 months, and just feeling absolutely crushed by the overwhelming scale of the challenge. And now, as I mentioned, I've done a couple of long ocean rows since the Atlantic. Now I very carefully control my thoughts. I'll think about today and what do I need to do today to get a bit closer to my goal. And I'll think about the goal itself, but I refuse to think about any of the days and weeks and months in between now and my destination. I really do just take it one day at a time.
That's a great life lesson, because I think we all look too far ahead when we have a problem to deal with or an issue to deal with.
And then it can seem such an enormous problem, can't it?
Yes, that's right.
I regularly have to remind myself of this. I was having a really tough day yesterday with just sorting out my logistics for the next few months and for this year's expedition, and everything's complicated by the fact that my bag was stolen before Christmas with my laptop and my phone and my driver's license, my credit cards in it. So that's just making life that much more difficult. And yesterday I just felt really overwhelmed, and I had to sort of coach myself through it and say, just take it one item on your to-do list at a time. Don't think about the whole to-do list. You can only do the next one. You can't do them all at once.
Do you have a
I have to keep reminding myself of these lessons.
Yes. What I was going to ask you was, do you have a team or helpers to assist you with all of these details? You're not trying to do everything now at this point by yourself, are you? I mean, I know you have to do the race alone, but do you have people helping you with the details?
Not a great deal, no. I have lots of people who help out in small ways, like somebody who keeps an eye on my website for me, and last year I had a program director who was sort of my shore manager and was helping out with a lot of logistics, but I don't have the money to pay her at the moment.
Yeah.
I've got another fantastic friend who helps me out with my boat on a regular basis.
Uh-huh. Are there rules against having assistance in terms of doing a race? This seems a little different than the typical sailboat races, the yacht races. They have huge teams and a lot of preparation and boats following after them and sometimes planes overhead. That doesn't seem to be the case with these rowboats, is it?
That's right. I don't have any of that. I don't have a large budget. In fact, at the moment, I don't have any. I don't have a full-time team, and I certainly don't have anybody following me or keeping a physical eye on me while I'm on the ocean.
Do some of the people that are in these races, do they have that kind of assistance?
No, rowers tend not to. No, I can't think of a single rower who has had an actual support vessel alongside. There are other kinds of ocean enterprises where they do sometimes have support vessels, but rowers tend not to. I don't think we have the money.
Well, it seems like it's more of a challenging race then. You don't have sponsors. Oftentimes you'll see, and I am not negating the challenge of these open ocean yacht races or anything with these huge teams, but oftentimes you will see sponsors for listed on their
Well,
sales or something. This doesn't seem to be that type of race. It does seem to be more of the great challenge of that person against the open ocean.
it certainly feels that way. I would just like to mention that I do have a sponsor. My boat's called the Brocade, after a company based in Silicon Valley. Unfortunately, they came in a very generous amount, but it was only ever going to be enough to cover about 20% of my costs across the Pacific. So that money is now pretty much run out.
So you did have that sponsor. What kind of company is the Brocade?
They're based in Silicon Valley. They do high-tech data storage systems.
Okay, so there's nothing in the rules that says that you can't do it. It's just a matter of finding...
Well, what I'm doing now is just an independent expedition. It's not a race, so I can absolutely make up my own rules.
Okay, so
And
this
I think
did not...
the Ocean Row would be more than
Right.
happy to welcome a sponsor.
Well, you darn well better be able to make up your own rules when you're out there on the ocean. I'm all for that for you. So the sponsor is for the current race and not for the one that you completed.
That's right. But
Yes.
I'd just like to emphasise that what I'm doing now is not a race.
Yes.
It's just me out there on my own doing an independent expedition.
All right.
And
Let's
this
finish
year will
with
be
talk.
sorry.
Let's finish up with talking about your race, and then if we have the time left, we'll get into a little more description of what this is you're doing now and why and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to get into the time that you were having problems, and it seemed like there were problems throughout the race. And I wonder if you can talk a little more about that. That's the thing that struck me the most, was trying to put myself in that position. I mean, sometimes I feel proud if I can, hammer a nail in the wall, and the idea of putting myself in that position is very hard for me to imagine. So I want you to tell my listeners and me some of the other problems that you encountered and how you dealt with them. And before you answer that, I want to ask the question, did you have a radio aboard that you could communicate with people or not?
Right. I'll try and take those in order.
Yes. I wanted to ask that in the beginning because I think that's important. Answer it any way you wish. But.
Okay. Well, I had a satellite phone on board so that I could communicate, but that actually broke about a month before the end of the crossing. So I had no communications whatsoever after that. To come back to the question about the breakages, yeah, there were a few problems. For example, all 4 of my oars broke before I reached halfway.
What broke? Oh, the oars?
My oars. So
Oh,
I
no.
put in a main set and a spare set, but the weather was so rough that year on the Atlantic, like regularly 20-foot waves, that all 4 of those oars got broken. And I'm not the most handy person around the house. I'm a bit like you, quite proud if I manage to hang a picture without it falling off the wall. But when you're out there, and you're on your own, you really don't have any choice but just to try and come up with the inner resources and the practical resources to fix the problem.
I want to interrupt you here because we are running out of time, and I think one thing that I do want people to know is that not only about these problems, but halfway through the race, things got so bad you did contemplate suicide. And I think that's a more important issue in this limited time that we have left. What happened to create the thought, and what stopped you? We've got about 2 minutes.
I would say I only fleetingly looked down into the ocean when I was just having a really low point, when I felt like I'd been out there forever, but I still had half an ocean to go. And I remember just looking down into the water and thinking, that would be an easy way out. But then, I thought of my mum waiting for me, and my father had died only the previous year, and there was no way that I could do that. And anyway, I was finding that I had too much to live for. So it was really only a very fleeting thing, but in a way it sort of helped me to know that there was a choice, that I was strong enough to choose not to take the easy way out, that I was strong enough to choose to carry on with this challenge.
Well, good for you.
To the end.
I'm glad you did. I'm glad you did,
Me
because
too.
yes, I think that's important for people to know. What's the one thing that you do want people to take away from your book? Is it to live one day at a time, take one thing at a time?
I think it would be that we're capable of so much more than we think we are. There were so many times out there on the ocean when I thought I'd absolutely hit my limit, but had no choice but to carry on beyond my limit. And you know what? I'm still alive. And I just, for so long, I was held back trapped in my old life by fear of the unknown. And once I actually got out there into the unknown, I found it was a lot less scary than I thought.
Good for you. Well, you're to be congratulated on that. And you're continuing now with being out on the open ocean, but it is not a race. What is it? I'm bidding to be the first woman ever to row solo across the Pacific. So I've done 2/3 of it now. Oh, my.
Last year I did San Francisco to Hawaii. Sorry, that was 2008. Then last year I did Hawaii to Kiribati, which is a little island nation on the equator. And this year I'm aiming to go from Kiribati to Australia. And I'll be setting out round about April the 15th. And it'd be great if people would follow along on my blog, which is at rozsavage.com.
rozsavage.com. Is that correct?
Yes, that's
we
right.
want
I'll
people
be
to hear that.
blogging every day and also tweeting and posting photographs and sending back videos occasionally. So I really try and bring it alive, and I think my audience enjoys it. So it would be great if some of your listeners would follow along.
I'm sure they will. I know I will, Roz. I think it's wonderful, your accomplishments, and I think that you have done something that encourages other women. I want to thank you for being here. We're out of time. Thanks so much, and I hope you've got another book in the works and come back to see us then. Thank you so much,
I would
Roz.
love to. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. We've been talking to Roz Savage about her new book, Rowing the Atlantic, Lessons Learned on the Open Ocean, and of course, listeners can find a copy at their local bookstore.